Coming to you from the Windy City. Welcome to Let's Talk Shop, a podcast about all things cloud and enterprise tech. Listen to insights and guest interviews with IT thought leaders and professionals. Now, here's your host, Elias Khnaser.
Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of Let's Talk Shop. Today's guest is actually a friend. He is one of the sharpest technologists I know. He is a visionary. He is the vice president of digital transformation and segmentation marketing at Equinix. Steve Madden, welcome to the show.
Hi, Eli. Thank you.
It's great to have you, and we're having you on the heels of, you guys just published the GXI report, and you just completed in September the Equinix Digital Leaders Summit, which I was the host, so I'm super excited to get your feedback on that. But I want to start with GXI.
Okay.
So GXI is something that you used to share with us when I was an analyst at Gartner. It was a yearly thing. But for our audience, those that are watching and listening that don't know GXI, what does it stand for? What is GXI?
Yeah, no, good question. I think I still answer that today. But GXI, which stands for the Global Interconnection Index, was a report that we started years and years ago. It's in its 6th volume now. So 6 years we've been running it because we were trying to find a way to explain to the industry what was happening with digital growth and data and exchange of data and therefore traffic. Because, other things like GDP and things weren't really tracking or showing what was really happening. So because we're in a situation where we're in the center of digital between all the clouds, all the networks and all the different companies that were moving very rapidly towards digital infrastructure, we were able to track growth, and we used as a proxy interconnection, which is the private exchange of data between two counterparties. So essentially, you're in a carrier neutral co-location center. So is the person you want to exchange traffic with. Think of it as a cable between the two cabinets. They just exchange data directly and privately. And all of the networks do that to build the internet. All of cloud connectivity happens that way inside our facilities. But the index takes that view from a broad industry, including interconnection bandwidth and totals from outside of our data centers, other partners, peers, and competitors as well. So it's an industry view of data growth and therefore digital business growth using that interconnection as a bandwidth proxy.
So that's really fascinating. How did you guys think of that to actually measure, how many partners you're connected to, the amount of data that is being exchanged, how much that data is increasing over the years? You mentioned clouds. You're connecting to multiple regions within these cloud providers. You're connecting to multiple cloud providers. So I'm curious, how did this idea come to be?
Well, when we started working beyond networks and clouds, because the networking companies typically already knew what they were doing. They were trying to build a large-scale interconnected, network that is the internet. But enterprises, when we started talking to them back in 2015, it was a very counterintuitive model, because essentially instead of it being everything centralized inside your own data centers and your own infrastructure and LANs, and you own all the apps and you have to figure it out yourself, the whole model became completely inverted in that now all the things you wanted to connect to and do business with and interact with were outside of your typical network and had to interact with other people. And so we called that an interconnection-oriented architecture. It's like, how do you stitch these together? And what was obvious from that was the most efficient way to do it is in the places where the most people you needed to interact with were going to be, was where you should be as having a point of presence to locally interconnect with those counterparties. So you weren't sending data all over the internet for no reason. So traffic exchange is super efficient. Growth in those areas is super high. And it became a nexus point of that's where we see exchange between different companies happening. So if your digital business is about how you're interacting digitally with all your counterparties, then these exchange points shined a really good light on how fast and how quickly that was growing, not just where geographically, but you're right, who and how quickly the connections are happening to other different industries and companies.
So if I'm an organization, an enterprise, why would I want to read this report? Like, what kind of insights can I glean from this report that would be insightful to me?
Sure. And so when we talk to customers, we will hit maybe different levels of maturity in a customer. If you're an enterprise that hasn't done a lot in terms of digitizing your infrastructure or your business, hasn't gone very far yet with cloud and everything, it kind of gives you a view of what the leaders in different industries, and we have the list of all industry types in there. It's not just the networks and clouds, but all industries of all kinds are referenced in there with what like healthcare is doing, what energy is doing, right? And how much they're doing, how quickly over time. It gives you a benchmark of what are people in my industry or companies like me doing, how quickly, how fast. And we also link then to how they're actually doing it with instructions in terms of steps and a whole map. So it's useful to figure out, well, what is my digital strategy and what should I be thinking about in terms of digital infrastructure? Now, if you're a mature customer, you've already done it and you're very far along, it's still useful because you can still come back and see where are you in terms of what's going on and what's changing, and do you need to update or modify your strategy?
And this is useful for enterprises and organizations to understand, because as we move towards a digital economy, I believe it's the World Economic Forum that said the digital economy is 16% the total GDP today, or something like that.
No, it's much higher than that.
Yeah. So it was a number like that. But so it's important for organizations to realize that as we move more and more towards this digital economy, if you're not participating to the extent that your competitors are participating,
That's right.
then they're going to miss out, right? Because those that get there first are going to get the lion's share.
Well, exactly. And that's why that's actually putting a finer point on the term of digital disruption, because, we started this whole digital and shift to digital and people talking about digital disruption. But you couldn't articulate to an enterprise what that actually meant. Like, how am I going to be disrupted?
Right.
And the reason is because if those companies have inverted, then their IT debt, how much infrastructure that they have to run with their own skill set and services, and how slow and sort of difficult it is for them to change. When they've inverted, is completely opposite. They can change on a dime, spin up things anywhere, completely re-architect, through APIs, and react to business changes and other technology changes much faster than traditional companies can. And as that happens over time, they're continuing to change very quickly, while the slower companies that are sort of followers are changing very slowly. And the gap between the two in terms of capabilities is getting broader and bigger. And so it's starting to hit this pass where it's almost like a chasm of a huge amount of transformational change with a reduction in the amount of time you have to do it. And it's becoming digital disruption. Like, how do I solve for skill sets, rapid change in my infrastructure, solve for the capabilities I don't have, do it all within a budget of, usually cost neutral, and be effectively doing that quickly. That's the pressure companies are feeling today. And so, disruption is driving the need for change, need for infrastructure. The index tells you what the leaders are doing. It's kind of like a get out jail free card.
So, and that's beneficial also to your vendors and partners, right? Because that will help them develop products, I'm assuming, or services to cater to this. Is that how?
You're absolutely right. I mean, there's an ecosystem of participants that are going on. We've got a whole marketplace of suppliers selling hardware and software and infrastructure services that need to position their infrastructure to be made available. So tech manufacturing, for example, and during the pandemic, switched very much from a asset-based depreciation model to a flexible consumption model, right? So you can buy as much as you want. It's kind of like leasing, but it's very much more about a cloud consumption model. So they could offer their services in a pre-deployed manner and make them available for allocation. So where are they going to do that? So the index tells you where the demand is, by which industry and which
region too, right? Geography.
And so they can kind of go, well, if we're going to go into that market, then we should go here, here, and here, and we should start looking at these targets and these spaces. Same with providers, service providers, SaaS companies, etc. Storage as a service, UCaaS. Where are the constituent consumers of my function? Where are they?
How fast are they growing?
Yeah, and where are they building out? And where should I go to?
Yeah. Okay, so we talked about why would I, take a look at it, read it, understand it, digest it, maybe ask questions. But so, what's the theme for this year?
Well, as I said before, we've been modeling how infrastructure is inverting. Right now, you're using a lot more partners than you did before. A lot of your compute and storage is in clouds and analytic infrastructure, and you are going to start using more companies peering and directly exchanging data with more companies than not. There could be data providers, there could be supply chain integration, there could be technology infrastructure. So as this grows and it starts to move to the fact that you're more connected on where you're supplying your compute, data storage, and networking, et cetera, more connected in where you're getting your SaaS and your CRM and your ServiceNow and all these different systems you use for your back office, and then how you're going to start doing business across all those parties and counterparties means you're becoming more and more interconnected into this ecosystem. The reality of that, and what the index is saying, is that ecosystem is ultimately going to become your infrastructure.
Interesting.
So the ecosystem is your infrastructure. Who you have access to, who you can turn up, what you can get access to, what capabilities you can turn on and change are going to define how quickly you can move and how quickly you can adjust to what you need to do in the industry. So it's very much moved from cloud first world to, oh no, it's all happening at the edge. And it is, the edge is still growing faster than the core. But ultimately, when we get down to that mature state, it's who you have access to and who you're exchanging data with, where, that's going to ultimately drive, the performance of your business.
So I've heard Equinix talk often about digital first. What are the components of a digital first strategy? What do I need to do? How do you summarize it for me?
Yeah. So one of the things we're also observing was it was actually in volume 4 or volume 5 of the index, we were showing the difference between providers, digital leaders, and digital followers. And what we're trying to differentiate was what was different about digital leaders than digital followers. Like, everybody's still doing the same things, but what's different? And the difference was that in cloud first, it made a lot of sense that I free up my infrastructure. I got a flexible consumption model. I can grow and scale at speed. There's a lot of reasons why you absolutely have to have cloud as part of your infrastructure. But a lot of companies were doing that while business as usual stayed the same. So they completely re-architected they were digitizing business as usual, basically. They completely re-architected their infrastructure. But if business didn't change or benefit from those capabilities, then they started to see things like cost sprawl, or they started to have trouble justifying what they were doing. Whereas the leaders were transforming the way they were doing business at the same time as the way they were changing their infrastructure. So all of their decisions and investments were driven by revenue, not cost. So what digital first means is TCO was the old way we did it. I used to call it my grandparents', way of measuring, investments. But today's digital leaders look at it as cost of revenue. So the more I invest, if revenue is going up proportionally higher, then keep investing. Don't stifle or stagnate my infrastructure, and certainly don't cap it or prevent it from growing. And so digital first is, what is your business going to need to do? How is it going to need to compete? Who do you need to be connected with? Which tables and marketplaces do you need to be at? And then build your infrastructure around that, so you're supporting the business revenue first and gaining digital advantage.
Okay, so selfishly, and here I have to ask, so what you're describing is essentially moving the core into a place that can have the potential to scale infinitely, let's call it.
Yeah.
But also is in a position to interconnect to multiple partners and vendors. You're calling that the ecosystem.
Yep.
And it's also potentially bringing you closer to the edge. Am I getting this correctly?
Yeah. No, the core is where you create what your digital presence is going to be.
Okay.
And you're right, it's distributed across multiple regions because you're connected in many clouds in many regions. So it's a distributed core, regional, right? Then your ecosystems are, who do I need to do business with, either to sell to or to subscribe from? And do I have access to those tables and those markets? And you're right, the edge is where business happens. You still got to hit your end users, your customers, your places of business, logistics, transportation, facial recognition at airports, all the stuff that's happening in the field, still driving data at the edge. And if your architecture has a distributed digital core, is connected into all of the digital ecosystems, and is available locally within milliseconds to all the places where business matters, then you have a core ecosystem edge to cloud architecture.
That's fascinating. I mean, that's not what I think of when I think of Equinix. I mean, it's more than a colo company, apparently.
Yeah, I'd like to think that colo is kind of the new on-prem for all the critical infrastructure you need, where you need to remain in control. You want the lowest latency, you want the highest volumes, and you want access to all the clouds and all the services, and you want to be able to change it. That's what we provide.
So expand a little bit about the edge. So how does Equinix play at the edge? I mean, if it's all about proximity, does it require that Equinix locations be in all of the metros where I'm trying to connect to? What's the value prop that Equinix brings to the edge?
I think if for different companies, the definition of the edge would be different.
That's fair.
Autonomous vehicles are going to say it's the car, but when you think about it, you have lots of endpoints and lots of devices in metro cities. Well, that data is being aggregated back to a point where it's coming off the air, right, or wireless, Wi-Fi, cellular, etc., onto a tower, landline, base connection, and from there it's bandwidth, right, back to cloud. We are that on-ramp and off-ramp between where the wireless and last mile internet-based access hits real major telecommunications and pipes and infrastructure, including cloud infrastructure, to get back to the core, right? So we're in a position where people can place capacity, compute, and services and functions in the metro city and service, potentially hundreds of pop-up stores, branches, vehicles, whatever it is they're looking after in that field. So whether they're still thinking of the edge as being in my factory or in my car, that data and those sources of information are being aggregated somewhere. They're being exchanged with other counterparties somewhere. So navigation data, telemetry data, insurance information, all of that stuff's got to be exchanged. Payments is a good example. When you swipe your credit card, there are 9 different companies that interact on that transaction, from credit checks to fraud detection to all these different things, including the geosync to your phone. All of that happens at the actual edge, in that metro city, not back in the nearest cloud domain. So that's just going to grow, right? Because the demand for data at the edge is growing exponentially fast. In fact, the edge is growing twice as fast as the core. And so we've got to position ourselves to provide capacity and bandwidth and all access to all the telecommunications, 5G services and things you need to service that bandwidth. Because while interconnection's growing, you'll see the index will tell you how fast interconnection bandwidth's growing. The internet's not growing anywhere near that pace. And so
So you're saying interconnection is outpacing the internet growth in terms of data?
Interconnection growth is about 12x internet growth. In fact, internet traffic only makes up about 30% of overall interconnection.
Interesting.
But if the last mile, like this call we're having right now, is driving up bandwidth demand, then that's why we need 5G and we need all these carriers and we need to beef up bandwidth at the edge, because right now it's not going to be able to handle the growth. It's going to become the bottleneck. So we are going to push a lot more of technology, a lot more access and a lot more services to the edge. We have to. And not just because of bandwidth constraints in certain big markets like, New York, but even, digital equality, like access to the internet, all that kind of stuff. The edge is going to matter. Where we play a role is we bridge the difference between the towers and the telcos geographically to link back to pipelines back to the core and to the cloud.
So while we're on the topic of the edge, because this is fascinating. So, I mean, there's a lot of promising technologies that we're messing with, that we're playing with, that some people are operationalizing, but it hasn't gone mainstream yet, right? So whether it's the Google glasses or Microsoft's HoloLens, I believe it's called, or, there are rumors of Apple coming out with different types of devices, though augmented reality and virtual reality, it's here for gamers and in some application, maybe remote training or remote assist, but it hasn't gone mainstream yet. We've got the metaverse that, it could be a joke to some, it could be reality. We really don't know where that's going, but I think it'll settle on something. There'll be some kind of applicability. So the future, you're right, is there's going to be a lot of things happening at the edge, analytics, real time. Is 5G going to be enough?
It's funny. I don't know. I came across some research, and I want to make sure I get this right. But there's actually 5G would sustain us through to 2025, and then people are already throwing out 6G, but it's actually not that. There's a whole other technology that is actually used in X-ray machines at airports and things, but can also be used for data transfer, and that essentially is a whole different technology where we got to look at. But understand that the rate of data growth is compounding, not just growing, but compounding at such a high rate. That's why you haven't seen things like set-top boxes and gaming consoles stuff go away, even though different cloud providers tried to do 100% cloud gaming, because a lot of computation and a lot of processing still has to happen very close to the end user. And definitely with VR and Oculus and, and the metaverse and all these different things, the amount of computational processing to make it feel like a realistic experience is huge. And as soon as that degrades a little bit, it actually can make it motion sickness, not feel like you're engaged and actually have an adverse effect. Augmented reality, not as bad, because augmented reality is only portraying some things over existing
Overlays.
over existing vision. It's not trying to render so much information. So overlay is seeing traction. They're using it in manufacturing. We actually even use augmented reality in data center construction. So you can see on the top of the building where cooling systems are going to be placed and what that does to flow and view and whatever else. They can actually model this so you can simulate what it looks like when you're walking through the building before it's even been completed. Those kinds of practical and also manufacturing engines and things, all those kinds of practical things help. You can go into a data center for a customer, go to their cage, and it will tell you over the overlay which system blinking like the whole machine is red. This is the one I want you to do something with, or this is the one we want you to touch. It's just this extra information I think makes it useful. That'll come first. But the full immersion is going to take a little bit longer, like you said, and it's going to require a lot of bandwidth at the edge.
So that's so far advanced, and this is the importance, I guess, for folks that are watching this and listening to this to realize that if their business isn't along, just imagine if the metaverse does go mainstream or augmented and virtual reality does go mainstream and they're not ready to take advantage of this. But so selfishly, because I hosted the Equinix Digital Leaders Summit and we had some really cool customers that participated in these panels like Shell and CDP and National Instruments, I learned a little bit about what these customers were doing. So for example, I'd love to get your take. National Instruments mentioned that they pretty much got rid of their MPLS network and replaced it with Equinix, because the different Equinix locations are connected, using high speed, low bandwidth. They were able to use that and again, bring data and proximity to where their users are. Do you see a lot of customers using this? Is this part of rethinking the digital core?
Yeah, I mean, it is. I mean, let's just start by grounding it in that essentially what we did is inside each of our data centers, because all of these companies were trying to connect to each other, obviously running cables, like I mentioned earlier as a simple example, becomes a bit cumbersome over time. So we software defined that. So now anyone can connect to anybody inside the data center with an API call. And that's direct layer 2, layer 3. So they're connected. But then we connected all the data centers together. So every Equinix metro data center in every metro around the world is connected to at least 2, if not 3 other metros. So it's a fabric. And each connection is 2 network provided links from 2 different providers. So we have redundant paths to different metros, between different providers. And they're all connected back into this software-defined network, which means, to cut to the chase, if you were in, Milan in a data center and I was in New York, we could directly, privately connect to each other and exchange traffic with an API call in a few minutes, and use that to increase bandwidth or decrease bandwidth as needed and turn it off if we don't want it anymore with no tail. And that kind of an architecture enables people to move out of a more rigid infrastructure with long-term contracts, terms and conditions and things, and be able to just dynamically change who they want to talk to, when and why. This is enabling our network service providers to offer their solutions because they run theirs on top of this same fabric. In fact, our biggest consumers of the fabric are actually the networks. But a lot of enterprises have figured out what they can do with it too. And so they're turning off links that are like hardline links that are long-term, renewals, and just moving to shared bandwidth on interconnected infrastructure over the fabric. And so you can do 2 things. You can re-architect your global backbone using us and or the network partners on our platform. And that means that you're probably going to rip out about 60% of your overall carrier costs. It reduces latency by about 30%, and it's 100% dynamic. You can just change it whenever you need to.
So the other thing that came out that is near and dear to my heart, and it came out during, again, the Equinix Digital Leaders Summit. It's something I researched for a long time when I was at Gartner, was cloud adjacency. And cloud adjacency is the fact that you are adjacent to not just the cloud providers, but also other providers. This is, that ecosystem that is being created. But being cloud adjacent opens up a whole new slew of architectures, right? Like, simple things like, I'm going to put my storage at an Equinix facility and then just point services from an AWS and Azure or Google, whichever cloud provider, back to that storage. So that gives me flexibility, but it also, for a lot of folks that haven't seen this type of architecture, there's a lot of security questions. There's a lot of, hey, we always put the storage or the data close to the compute. Are you seeing more and more customers open up and realize the benefits, the power of a cloud adjacent architecture infrastructure?
Yeah, absolutely. And again, it's kind of like, it's not, do I put it here or do I put it there? It's also what should I put here versus what should I put there? So, it's not all or nothing, and it's also, the other thing I want to come across quickly is a lot of these companies are trying to get out of the business of running this stuff themselves.
That's right.
And so their initial thinking is, but if I put it cloud adjacent, that means I have to manage it. That's actually not the case. There's actually quite a lot of partners and providers that offer storage as a service or the infrastructure as a service inside carrier neutral colocation next to the cloud. So it's still a cloud-like consumption model. So don't get lost there. But the reasons why they're doing it are either regulation and control, in that some regulators require that you can actually point to the cage that's containing your data. It's a little bit archaic, but it's still around. And so you can't do that in a cloud infrastructure if you don't even know where the data centers are, let alone where your storage is and which cabinet. So from an extreme standpoint, the heavy regulated industries where they're concerned about being, impacted by regulation, leave it there. But for performance and volume reasons, it's still a better place in a lot of cases. Because if that data is being exchanged across multiple clouds or 4 or 5 other different counterparties, then the most efficient way to do that is to house it in the shortest distance to all those participants. Otherwise, you're backhauling or elbowing all over the place. And you start to see that when we start doing things like cloud to cloud routing, like, well, now you've got ingress and egress and all this stuff going on. And, and not to mention the complexity where some clouds use one encryption mechanism and this cloud uses a different encryption. And now you've got to elbow and decrypt and encrypt. And like, when you string together what that transactional flow looks like with all these hops and all these changes, you got to ask yourself, what does my throughput look like? And how much latency am I actually eating by doing all this? Whereas if the data was located in the center of all these with sub-millisecond access to all of these clouds, you've halved, or if not, reduced to a fraction what that transactional cost is. And if the platform you're using for storage, there's many different examples, and we've got partners that do pure storage, Oracle Exadata, NetApp, all of the ones you'd expect to see, Dell, etc. All the ones you expect to see are there. They're also hyper-converged infrastructure and perform exponentially faster than just generalized virtualized services as well. So if you're trying to solve for IOPS for databases, an architecture that's simply designed to do that is always going to outperform anything you subscribe to on a virtualized platform. So they're seeing performance benefits, they're seeing cost reduction in data movement, they're seeing protection and control. And it's also a factor of the fact that not everything can go, or not all their workloads can move into cloud. So it's also a safety net that anything that can't go any further or is not ready to go further can live adjacent and perform just fine. It's only when you leave it in your own original data center and try to backhaul everything backwards and forwards to cloud that people realize that that's a huge latency problem. And they see a lot of performance issues.
Speaking of, your traditional on-premises data center, one of the themes that came out of the Digital Equinix Leaders Summit, we had a session on sustainability. That was, of all the topics that we talked about, I'll be honest, that was probably the one that was most interesting to me, because I hadn't looked into it. I hadn't taken it seriously even. So it was very eye-opening to see kind of what was happening there. So if we have folks that are listening, would you recommend that the first thing they do on the path to sustainability is actually exit some of these on-prem data centers? Because by being at Equinix, if I'm not mistaken, CDP gave Equinix an A- on, I don't know why it's an A-, you guys need to work on that, but it was an A- on sustainability. But for customers, is that first step moving out of the traditional data center into an Equinix location?
Yeah, I mean, it's really the same message, but for a different contextual reason. You want to be free of long-term fixed IT debt. You want to shelve the things that aren't your business strengths, right? That not what you're in the business of. You're not the best in the industry doing it, and instead you just want to source or subscribe to the things that are far superior, far better, and easier way of doing it, and focus your resources, attentions on what you are differentiated in the market. So if you are not a data center company and you're not, leading in sustainability in that space, and you're paying exorbitant rates for electricity, and you're suffering from, how do you reclaim depreciated hardware and dispose of it?
Right.
There's a lot of stuff around that's really a lot of effort and very complex. If that's not the business you're in, then you're not doing yourself much of a service to try and put that much resource and that much attention on maintaining that, especially when the only customer of that facility is typically you. At least we have the other benefit of not just being able to mainstream change things dramatically, like you just mentioned, but we can also spread that benefit and the cost of doing that across all of our companies that are in those facilities. And so it's essentially, it's becoming rarer and rarer why there's a business reason to keep doing that yourself. And we're always talking to customers about not so much that, but how quickly can I get out of my facilities? Who can help me do it? And we need to do it at large scale. So I need to be able to run my existing facilities, migrate out onto the new architecture, and shut this thing down. And a lot of companies need help doing it because their skills and resources and time is just not necessarily as available as it needs to be.
Yeah, and there's some pressure that's being exerted on these organizations as well. Sometimes it's the board of directors that's making sure that, hey, we need to be sustainable, or we need to hit these types of metrics, and that they're forcing them to make some of these shifts. But it's also the market dynamic, right? I mean, one of the things I learned was that on RFPs and RFIs, there was an entire sustainability section. So in order to work or to deal or to connect with others, sustainability folks only want to do business essentially with folks that are taking sustainability seriously. Did I get that right?
Yeah, it's an interesting. I wouldn't want to call it a byproduct, but the capabilities of a digital infrastructure lend themselves tremendously well to solving for sustainability at the same time. Yeah. And it seems like digital seems to be the answer for everything, whether it's a new regulation on data privacy, or a cost, or an economic issue, or a war in Ukraine. Watching what these companies do and react to respond, all comes back to their ability to change and react quickly. And so sustainability, moving into a provider that already has the leading ranking and progress and growth that aligns to what your company strategy is, solves for your own core infrastructure, but then access to ecosystems of the most sustainable providers allows you to then very quickly change the rest of your portfolio to also equally be sustainable. And in this regard, we provide credits and proof of benefit, so you can show your own customers and investors that you are doing these things, and you get credit for the change. But then the last thing that sort of comes back into this is, we know where this is headed. And as I said before, the most efficient way with the lowest carbon footprint and energy requirement to handle this burst of massive data growth is to be co-located to the people we want to connect to and exchange it over interconnection. It's obviously the highest bandwidth, most efficient, most secure way of doing it. So you've already lent yourself towards growth, right, in that market. And with the ability to spin up and access those services anywhere in the world at the edge, your impact on the environment and the physical world can be managed, measured, and sort of start to be changed by what you do in transforming your own edge in your own industry. And so it's starting to shift to less about, I want to worry about building my own data center, and more about, no, my data center is green, my partners are green, and I'm working on energy reduction, water waste, all these sorts of things out in the environment. I'm focusing on the things that are super important and not on maintaining stuff that's really not the business I should be in.
Last time I saw you, you were telling me about you had this new hobby of collecting NFTs, and you went on a sprawl of buying NFTs. Is that true?
No. No, NFTs.
So you don't have Spider-Man, first edition on an NFT?
No, not at all. I mean, I like the idea of digital assets. Clearly, they're strategic. I don't think we're savvy enough as an economy to really understand.
It's a ways out.
The
only time anyone gave me a really good example of what NFTs could be used for was for identity purposes. Like again, when this whole COVID passports was becoming popular, that could have been an interesting idea for that to become some form of an NFT that you could authenticate and validate, as opposed to everybody just downloading a blank passport and filling it out.
Well, I think you're right. I think if you think about that, you've hit on something really important. There's also an inversion happening with your own personal data.
Yeah.
So instead of everyone keeping bits and pieces of stuff that may or may not be accurate on you, I think eventually you're going to have your own wallet, so to speak, that you can let providers access on a privilege basis as to what they're allowed to see, to gain medical research or health records or buying patterns or behaviors, and actually make it lucrative for you. If they want that information, let them pay for it.
That's right.
But I also tell you, just before that rumor spreads, we're also not actively looking to buy up data center real estate in the metaverse either.
No, I'm going to go buy everything Equinix related in the metaverse.
I sort of thought, what would be running in those data centers? Like is this like an Inception problem? Like, are we going to have the metaverse
simulation within a simulation?
Yeah, no, we're not doing that. That would just break the space-time continuum, I think.
That's funny. There was a movie called The 13th Floor. I don't know if you've seen it. It was a long time ago. It was about how we're living in this matrix world, but then we created a matrix within the matrix, so to speak. It was really interesting.
Well, no, and Inception is a super complex and a very clever movie, but it always makes my head hurt.
Yeah, it does.
And,
like, wait, it's one of those where I've had enough. Yeah. Steve, my friend, the conversation with you is always enjoyable. It's always fun. I love chatting with you and seeing where your mind's at. We're going to have to do this again soon, maybe closer to the summer. Hopefully, maybe we get a sneak peek into next year's GXI, maybe before it publishes. This will be exclusive for Let's Talk Shop audience. So we'll have to do this again soon and see kind of where we're at that point.
I really appreciate it. Now, this has been fun. And also for people that are curious about anything we talked about, Elias right, the GXI we published, it's equinix.com/GXI-report. And also up on our site is a digital leaders guide where we modeled the behavioral characteristics and the steps, literally the steps that different digital leaders took across industries to build out their infrastructure. Take a look at that. It's going to give you a lot more guidance as to what you should do. And when you're ready to start moving in that way, we provide strategy briefings with our partners to bring everybody to the table to figure out how you architect that and move quickly. But whatever we can do to help, just let us know.
Just call 1-800-Equinix and just ask for Steve.
Yeah, Steve.
I'll have links to all of these resources in the description of this episode for those that are interested in exploring further. I've looked at the GXI report. It's actually fascinating. There's a ton of information to the point where he was talking about Inception makes your head hurt. There's so much data and information in here, it'll make your head hurt. But at the beginning of the report, there's some cool summary and highlights that I think are worth looking at. So
we're appeasing both the people that just want the answers and the people that want the data. They're both is in there.
All right, my friend. Well, thank you so much for coming on, and I look forward to seeing you again on the show soon.
Look forward to it. See you next time.
Take care now.